formal introduction, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay, so so thank you all for being here, and Diwal and I from University of Edinburgh will be the co-conveners of this panel, and thank you Himanshu, Sanjeev, and Christine, if she's gonna make it, for being here. So we are discussing in this panel the fiscal and administrative practices that emerged in public welfare spending after the COVID-19 pandemic. Not that it is over, but just after the onset of the pandemic. Our examination from the BOCW funds in India find that social welfare funds running into billions of pounds subsidized state expenditure during the pandemic. So that is the basic research that we started out with, and we are trying to build on that here. What we propose is that all the panelists provide a 3 to 5 minute summary of their main arguments. So I will start, and then it will be followed by Sanjeev and Himanshu and Christine, if she makes it. Then we will have a discussion by Diwal and I, and we will open the floor for your responses and then comments from participants, if there are any. If not, we will continue the discussion. If that's okay, I'll just start with my little piece. What I want to highlight are actually two main points. I'm sorry, I did not upload a paper, but it was still work in progress. So there are two main points that I want to make. The first is that there is a clear mobilization of BOCW funds post-pandemic. And this, I suppose, everybody here now kind of agrees on and you're aware of. Now, what we read into it is that this is an instance of workers, BOCW workers, particularly the poor migrant workers who are the intended beneficiaries, subsidizing the government expenditure through the use, particularly of BOCW funds for vaccination, ex gratia pandemic relief schemes, and food security needs. So we have examples from Punjab, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, and several states which find that during this pandemic, funds were mobilized through ex gratia schemes. In Delhi, it could be up to 25,000 rupees. So for every registered worker. And also the use of these funds, particularly for vaccination in Punjab and Tamil Nadu. So especially with regards to vaccination, now there is also simultaneously a moral question. Was it really right to use these funds? But on the other hand, should you not have used them? Because it is important to save lives than be stuck up with the technicalities of whether these funds should be used or not. So people we talked to spoke about, especially board members, bureaucrats, spoke about this dilemma, but choosing to use these funds for vaccination as a short-term immediate response because it would save lives. So that is one aspect. The second is that there is a specific kind of disenfranchisement of unorganized sector workers that the pandemic has highlighted. And the biggest evidence for this really is the increased registration numbers with the BOCW boards in the main cities that we have, like in Delhi, Bangalore, that we have looked at. This is because these boards are the quickest and the easiest ways for unorganized sector workers to access welfare, given there are no other, similarly operational boards or other welfare mechanism for interstate migrant workers. So in our conversations with bureaucrats and civil society actors, it has emerged that there are specific issues around the workers not finding representation in the welfare boards, despite the boards being comprised of workers' representatives. Bureaucrats say that trade union members do not really advocate on behalf of the workers. Some trade union members say that there are issues with the people who are representing workers in the boards because they have expertise in other areas, but not really with construction sector workers issues. So uh, the other issue is that the unorganized sector workers are not the biggest contributors to the coffers of the trade unions. So there is also a limited interest in mobilizing towards their welfare. So we do see that even within the category of workers, there is a clear organized and unorganized sector divide. And, this makes welfare an unattainable precious commodity for unorganized sector workers, particularly in this case, the building and other construction workers. So this specific vulnerabilities, especially of these workers, then we are trying to argue relegate them to second-class citizenship. So these are the main things that we're trying to say. So I will move to Sanjeev now. Over to you.
You're on mute, Sanjeev.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So the topic of my presentation is who is a construction worker, bureaucratic arbitrariness, entrepreneurial unions, and performance of eligibility in Delhi. So this is based on research I conducted between 2016 and 17. I'm also doing a little bit of research now to update my data. So some of my arguments have to do with how bureaucratic decision making sort of labeled these workers, right? So how did these workers negotiate with the bureaucracy, the labor bureaucracy, to claim entitlements? So of course, there is a board, and we know about the policies, but the workers have to register themselves with the board, and most of them are seasonal or itinerant migrants from across India, and they do not quite have a lot of documents, right? They do not have proof of residence. They do not have Aadhaar card, which has a Delhi address. So they have to sort of negotiate with the board office to register themselves so that they are eligible to get entitlements, right? Now that created a space for a lot of unions, and one has to make a distinction between advocacy unions which advocate for workers' rights, and they talk about consciousness, employer-employee relationship, and then there is a plethora of unions which kind of have this spirit of entrepreneurialism, right? We're like entrepreneurial. We want to help, and they have an ethic of what I call usefulness. We are useful, right? There is 4,000 crores of rupees lying there. Nobody is able to use that, right? And someday the government will wake up and spend that elsewhere. Likewise, in 2017, approximately 2,400 crores were lying there, right? And so this unions are saying, well, we are also representing working class people. We are ourselves working class people. So if you go and talk to these guys, or I mean, men and women, they are also from working class backgrounds. They hardly make 10,000, 12,000 rupees, right? And their job is to raise money for their unions, to increase subscription for their unions, and deposit a sum of money and all. So that is their purpose. Now, how does this work, right? How do the bureaucrats? They're actually outsourced from a private company. So if you go to the labor board, some of them are permanent employees, and most of them are actually temporary employees. They are also very lowly paid. In 2017, they were making approximately 17,000 to 18,000 rupees. They were overworked, understaffed, Now, of course, they make around 20,000 rupees. Now, so how do they determine who is eligible, who is not, who is a genuine worker, who is not a genuine worker? So these were questions that I was toiling with, and then I realized that there is this process of arbitrariness. For that matter, any bureaucratic process. I'm not taking an anarchist position, but it is resting on some sort of arbitrariness. How do you? And I call that the will to decide. And the decidability is not emanating from any kind of standardized protocol, but rather is based on some sort of discernibility. So how do you discern that this person is genuine or authentic and this person is not? And then I realized that one of the ways they had to decide is to actually see that the worker actually looks like a worker, right? He has cement paint, or he's not dressed up well, he's not wearing lipstick, all that stuff, right? And which is something not very relevant today because of online application. But then I have a little title today based on my data. So that's it's about textual mediation and how cyber cafes have taken the role and how they have to mediate and perform that these are genuine workers or authentic workers. So so apart from discussing about these sort of unions as well as the intricacies of bureaucratic rules, I also look at how the workers themselves have to perform that they are genuine workers, right? I mean, it may be a case that a genuine worker within quote, and these are very bogus and ambiguous categories, right? They're all workers, right? And sort of they are in and out of the construction sector. You could be a vegetable vendor today, but you could actually, I met a Muslim woman today, and she was saying that she has to go and do dihadi because she just lost her job. So they're in and out of construction sector. If they don't have jobs here, they could go and volunteer to do domestic work somewhere else, right? So but they have to perform. So I remember, if I quote from my paper, I remember one worker telling me, well, I know how to paint this wall very efficiently, but I may not be able to answer questions. What exactly is a distemper? I may fumble to pronounce these words in English. Right. So that is this cultural tactics they must deploy. And I'm bringing some anthropological insights into understanding this. And I read the call for papers, and when Dr. Himanshu Upadhyay invited me to give this paper, I saw and I say, okay, that could be a little bit of overlap and some sort of a dialogue. So you're looking at how funds remain unutilized and how these macro policies really sort of meet with some obstacles. But then let's go and do some bottom-up work to see what exactly is happening there. So so they have to continuously perform that they're genuine workers. And now, of course, I'm doing that bit of work to look at how cyber cafes mediate, and what exactly is happening there. So that's overall my paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Really interesting, and thanks for keeping to time as well. Himanshu.
Thank you, Deval. Thanks, Shruti and Sanjeev. So my paper tries to look at how the funds were mobilized and how the funds have remained unspent. Why do social welfare funds and social purpose fund remain unspent in India? Has to do with the fiscal instrument called cess. Fiscal instrument called cess is not that well studied as compared to fiscal deficit discussions, revenue deficit discussions, and discussions around budget making and accountability and auditing. So you would not see a standalone volume on cess and surcharges in India, for example. The only exception being that the recent 15th Finance Commission report, and 15th Finance Commission had commissioned series of studies around the fiscal issues, and one of them was by the Vidhi Center for Public Policy by Ashita Prasad Kotha and her colleagues, which looked at cesses and surcharges. And one of the editing level, proof level error is that most of the cess and surcharges are assessed as the percentage of excise duty or something like that. So BOCW also is mentioned in one of the endnote without a good correction at the editing level as that. But actually, building and other construction workers welfare cess is assessed on the cost of construction. And how do the assessing officers assess cost of construction is something that Subhash Bhatnagar and others who were the minds and trade union activists behind conceptualizing this cess also keeps talking about, because many a times the building plan approving authorities are the authorities that can determine what is the cost of construction and whether the builder is trying to under show the cost of construction. But many times the labor department officers who are made the assessing authorities, they are trained into doing labor inspections in factories and boilers and things like that. Much of their training is not about whether they are actually being able to collect as much cess as possible. The other big problem that remains is that the cess legislations are argued for, advocated about, be it about BOCW or about the Unorganized Sector Workers Welfare Act that came out in 2006, 2008. The legislations come out. Some ideas about cess legislation exist, but the states do not notify and construct the rules which are applicable at the state level. Within the federal governance in India, the parliament passing an act and issuing model rules does not let the expenditure streams come online immediately. And what we see is, even in Delhi, for example, which was one of the first three regions in India to have the welfare board, in Delhi, the welfare board actually came sometime in 2002, 5.5 years after the parliamentary act. And if you look at the cess, which is the earning stream coming online, that is also staggered. So from 2002, if you keep looking at the cess figures of how much cess is getting received, only after 2006, the cess receipts start showing you a buoyancy. Before that, there is no buoyancy that's there. So buoyancy in expenditure is definitely not there in Delhi up to 2006. Delhi, there is a recent CAG audit report that came out just now on 5th July in the Vidhan Sabha. And so some of us are trying to look at it and trying to understand. But this time, unlike the earlier audit that was done, which was from 2002 to 2011, those fiscal years, this time CAG has only looked at the 3 fiscal years, 2016, 17, 17, 18, and 18, 19. And what is something that remains, the recommendation again and the audit observation again in the previous performance audit as well as this one, is that out of 16 or 13 schemes, almost half of the schemes are not even claimed for. So there is something called family pension scheme that exists within Delhi BOCW board. There are no takers for family pensions. There are no claims made. And Sanjay was talking about registration and all. And what has happened on the registration figure is shocking. So if I can take you through registration data, the performance audit report now says that by the year ending 2019, the registered worker who were active members of the board had come down to less than 20,000. When the COVID struck us and when the Delhi state government made an announcement for COVID time cash assistance of 5,000 rupees each, that was announced on 24th March, and immediately that was mobilized. But how many workers got the first installment? The CAG audit report says that around 32,000 workers were there. In the second installment, the figure goes up a bit, which was in the month of May of the 2020. And the figures that are cited in Rajya Sabha are way above the May 2020 installment figures. So what we also need to understand is that there is a declining trend of membership that is visible in the case of Delhi. But coming back to this mobilization part and how the funds were spent during COVID time, the Union Labour Minister, using Section 60 and the powers granted to Union Labour Minister under Section 60, gave directions to the state counterparts to announce direct benefit transfers. So what he meant in that directive was that funds can be mobilized to give one-time cash assistance, or if need be, more than one installments can be given. But his directions are very clear, unambiguously worded in his letter. However, funds like this were getting announced by finance ministers also in that marathon press conference that happened, announcing the first COVID relief package in India. So she was heard saying that 30% of unspent fund from DMF can be spent on screening and testing and COVID health infrastructure related expenses. In light of that sort of signals that were coming from the central government, and after the finance minister's announcement, many of the state governments, so we have the papers that say in Tamil Nadu, there was a high level meeting of bureaucrats who decided that the Workers' Welfare Board will finance the food security related expenses as well. In Gujarat, a similar meeting took place and they diverted the funds there. As my colleague Shruti has spoken.
We have one more minute and then we should probably discuss as a group.
On vaccinations also, the funds were spent. And so the accountability concerns remains paramount. And how does one resolve moral dilemmas along with the accountability questions as to how to demand more social welfare expenditure from the budgetary allocations rather than robbing the cess funds. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. So we have a couple of, we've got 15 minutes left. The two of us can throw some questions out. I'd actually suggest that we both do that, but are really brief. You know, I've got a couple of themes that have come out that I think are actually really nice that in terms of the papers that fit together. So maybe if you want to say anything that comes to your mind, I'll put out a couple and then we can just have a broader discussion. So over to you and then I'll pick up a couple.
Okay, yeah, so I have a couple of quick questions. Hi, Sanjeev. So a lot of the things that you said, I have come across in Delhi and Kerala also. My question before we started this talk was also around the recent changes in the BOCW registration process and how online registration has really affected. I know that you have a section coming up on that. So around that, I was wondering how the new online registration system now affects the, trade unions, the services that they were offering earlier. Does it affect them at all? And also now that the let's say staff cannot physically verify the authenticity of the workers, does it change ideas of what is fake? And really in terms of the welfare implications, does it matter? And to Himanshu, yes, you spoke about the state of non-accountability around the cess funds and said that the cess as an instrument itself is the issue. But is it possible for us to understand at what point in the collection and transfer of cess and the journey of the cess funds, the opacity around these funds enter the process, and where do we identify, or is it even possible? And you say that in the paper that you uploaded, the way out is a social audit. So how do you think a social audit can even enable proper accountability processes? I'll stop here.
And then from my end, so let me just set out some themes that have come out. So let's just pull it all together in terms of how this bureaucratic scheme called the BOCW operates. And we have, first of all, a focus on the workers. So the heart of the scheme is registering workers and giving them money. That's sort of the hinge of the scheme. And so Sanjeev has told us, talked about it in terms of essentially a legibility scheme. So how do you see and register workers and in return give them stuff? And Sanjeev, your concern is one that's sort of generally true of most legibility schemes, whether the BOCW or otherwise. And one of them is, how are people categorized? Or rather, how do they fall within or outside the relevant category of the building worker? And there you're sort of concerned with the fact that actually it feels kind of arbitrary in terms of the how. And then the second concern related to that is in that zone of arbitrariness or discretion, maybe let's call it, how does that discretion get turned into an industry? So what's the political economy of that discretion? So, okay, that fits with a Foucauldian study of practices and then sort of a political economy of implementation. But I wonder if we might pull on a couple of other themes that have come up in this discussion, but also in other work around legibility schemes. So one thing that really struck me was your description of the arbitrariness in a lot of ways wasn't arbitrary. It was just that the people were using not bureaucratic categories, but aesthetic categories. What do you look like? What do you sound like? How do I judge using my sort of aesthetic judgment that you sort of fit? So where does that aesthetic come from? How does it fit together? How do they imbibe it? Is it solely in the mind of the bureaucrat? Is it actually, as you sort of imply elsewhere, sort of also produced in conversation with the unions? Do the workers get to portray that aesthetic themselves, the unorganized workers, or are they just sort of trying to fit into roles, images that are given from elsewhere? Second question, which is one that you touch on in your discussion, is how do workers circulate beyond this scheme? So to put it another way, can you situate the BOCW within a broader political economy of unorganized working? Are these people, mainly building workers, or do they circulate between a bunch of different unorganized sector livelihoods, which may or may not have their own formal or less formal welfare schemes? Right. So actually, are they encountering the state bureaucracy and its varying aesthetics in a bunch of different ways? Because there might be an argument that says actually formalization is not what you want. You don't want to reduce zones of discretion because it will force people into very, very narrow boxes that limit their access to the other schemes elsewhere. Then Shruti and Himanshu both put on the table a slightly separate thing, which is the moral dimension, both of this hinge, the identifying workers and giving them stuff, and also raising money. And there the question of, at the point of giving the money to the workers is, what moral language is the relationship with workers articulated in, and what's the broader social consequences of it? So authenticity. Are you really a construction worker? Are we avoiding fraud? Is one moral language set against the language of the morality of welfare? Do we care for you irrespective? We're not concerned with whether you're fraudulent or not. We're concerned with whether you're sort of doing well. And I'm just sort of, again, wondering whether we can say a little bit more now about whether or what sort of moral ideas are baked into not just registration and giving money, but also the accountability structures that are around the BOCW in terms of registration, collecting money, registering workers, and spending money. Are we really concerned with authenticity now? Are we concerned with welfare? How are those fought over? How are those instantiated? And then more broadly, Himanshu is putting on the table a slightly different set of accountability questions over the accruing and use of money, of the funds. So actually gathering the money and moving it through the fiscal architecture. So Himanshu is saying, the amazing idea that you can't actually file an RTI for audits if they haven't yet been tabled. And so it's actually in the interest of everybody not really to table any audits. Not of everybody, but you know what I mean, the relevant sort of bureaucratic actors. So what moralities are embedded in that, right? Is there a morality embedded in the accountability or non-accountability for moving funds? And is it doesn't seem to be necessarily that it's about fraud or about welfare. It might be something else. It might just be not wanting to take a decision, not wanting to actually shift the funds, because it then forces you to do stuff further down the line. It increases your workload, basically, or something else. But what morality is embedded in the accountability structures? So yeah, there are a few thoughts from my end, and we've got sort of 5 to 10 minutes to discuss. So maybe over to, should we do it in slightly different orders? Sanjeev, Shruti, Himanshu? Sanjeev?
Thank you. It could be a little noisy, some construction happening here. Okay, great questions actually, and I mean, responding to this would actually clarify. Let me just respond to Shruti first. Yeah, it has definitely affected the process of registration, but then there's something else happening now. There's a different order of arbitrariness, because it is claimed now by many unions and board officers that most of the workers who have registered in recent times are not construction workers themselves, because now they can furnish something called a self-declaration form and say that I'm a worker. So they don't have to go and get a stamp from the union, or they don't have to get a certificate from the contractor. Now, how do you do that? How do you sort of judge or gauge who is a genuine construction worker or not is really a challenge. So far, the claim applications have not been, through online sort of submission. So that now, I mean, you still have to go in person and do this. And the role of the unions has declined, but it will not become irrelevant at any point, because the workers, and I'm sort of drawing on Bourdieu quite a bit. So that's the underlining sort of Bourdieusian framework I'm using, but I didn't make it so explicit. So the workers who are not culturally equipped as such would have to rely on people who have a little bit of facility with negotiating with all this intricacies of bureaucracy. So they have to, if they don't know how to read and write in English, and most of the forms, despite being available in sort of Hindi, most often they are filling English, the forms in English and all, and so they need support. And that's why the cyber cafes and this the guys who run these cyber cafes have come to play a significant role. But the unions are still working to sort of mediate between workers and the boards. I'm not suggesting that all the unions are having this ethic of usefulness and they're just about instrumentality and all. And in fact, today when I was interviewing unions or union workers, they're trying to evade and say, look, we are a part of labor movement. We don't do labor cards. So doing labor card is seen as something despicable now. That's kind of an atmosphere at the board office. Incidentally, Manish Sisodiya wants this office to be part of his own office building. So it's moving there so that he could have surveillance who is coming and who is doing that. And these are the discussions happening there. So yeah, whether this is arbitrary or not, I would still think this is quite arbitrary. Of course, there is this particular aesthetics that sort of determine whether these are construction workers or not. But say, for instance, this statistical assistant who kept on saying, "Ghar mein rehti hai," she lives in the house. I mean, of course, this is a very ambiguous category. Ghar mein rehti, how did you determine that she lives at home? So that depends on discretion, the kind of commissions you receive, or the kind of effect you could generate, right? If you're subservient, if you're aggressive, if you're right, dabab, pressure. So what exactly you do at that time would determine, how you'll be categorized. So it's a much more complicated case than a bureaucrat having, an arbitrary take. So that's it has to do kind of negotiate at that point, right? But the other question is the one asked, and that's very interesting. How do you locate, construction workers within the body of unorganized workers? And that is something I want to actually develop. And if you have seen one key term I use is worker citizen. That is something I want to expand on, drawing the work of Rina Agarwal and Jan Bremen. So they're all workers. 99% of them are workers. Online registration is creating some sort of difficulty to determine, because now maybe people who are not part of unorganized sector as such, maybe sort of getting registered and all. I still have to do that bit of work, but most of them are workers, part of unorganized sector, and they cannot claim rights or entitlements as workers, so they fashion themselves as citizens, right? And so they claim that, okay, we didn't get anything, we don't have employment, at least give us something. Should we die of hunger, right? I'll stop there because other people have to respond for it.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Shruti?
Yeah, so I'll make a very quick comment. Just thinking about the moral language around authenticity, the BOCW registration only requires a worker to have worked as construction worker for 90 days in a year. That is a quarter of the year. So that means you can legitimately be a worker in other sectors and still be an authentic BOCW worker. So I feel it is interesting to actually think about why these concerns around authenticity even exist. The other aspect is the existence of the BOCW boards and giving welfare through this is also a moral justification for the state. So it kind of legitimizes the welfare, and this is particularly a moral justification for the state also. So I think there is a lot to think about the morality questions here. But I'll leave it here now and hand over to Himanshu now.
Yeah, thanks. Responding to your question about is it possible to understand opacity? And yes, it does remain opaque. It does remain opaque. Many a times I would hazard a guess that even the construction workers representative who are representing construction workers on the board might not know that the cess that has been lying in the treasury has not been transferred to the BOCW bank account. Because even for a researcher like me, only because of this engagement with audit reports and going through state finances audit reports and trying to understand state finances and the relevant budget heads, that I understand that there are two streams of the accrual of cess. One is through private builders, who most of the time will do a draft in the name of the board bank account and will attach it with the plan that they need to get approved from planning approval authority. However, not all construction that happens in states and union territories and in India is private construction. A lot of construction is public works. And in the case of public works, while making a payment to the builder or a private construction firm which has done this work, public work, CPWD or other departments, road and building departments, they'll deduct 1% of the cess. And they can retain 1% of that 1% as collection charges. But the 99% of the 1% cess that they have collected has to move to the board. However, as we have seen in the case of many states, sometimes this keeps lying in that particular head in the public accounts. So if you are someone who has been engaging with reading of state finance accounts and state finance audit reports, you can point that out, take that back to the members of board who are trade union representatives and make them articulate these things. Again, this articulation of making demands vis-a-vis finance ministry, vis-a-vis the political actors, that there is a liability that the state owes to the board because this is the money that has not been transferred to the board, gets articulated in Rajasthan, because in Rajasthan, the BOCW trade union representative also is part of the Congress-backed union, ATAC. And in the public meetings, he would say that I have reminded Ashok Gehlot that you owe us 300 crores. And thereby built his also social capital of being the true representative of the workers. But again, the experience of board members articulating this sort of demands from the state and the finance minister of chief ministers would be varying from state to state. So for example, in Telangana, we didn't have the sources who had told us that how Telangana made board pay almost 1,000 crores. And in Telangana, it was a sleight of hand because the board first transferred the money to SDRF account, State Disaster Response Fund. Then from the State Disaster Response Fund, Telangana State Civil Supplies Corporation got the money. But this entire trail of how the money moved within the system and how Telangana bureaucrats were trying to make it appear as if they had taken the money from the SDRF was unearthed because of the auditors who are doing their constitutional duty with due diligence. In the case of, just last sentence, in the case of Delhi, a lot of expenditure running into the range of 100 crores in last few years has been on education assistance. So actually, it's the children of construction workers who are getting a lot of money. And what is the audit remark that comes in the performance audit? It says that we didn't see the verification of whether these children who got the education assistance actually had parents who are construction workers. So this verification thing that Sanjeev has been raising comes at both the ends. First, at the time of registration. Second, even after the dispersals has happened, auditors raising this question. And I would have wished Delhi auditors to have pursued this through and produce a list of the beneficiaries or demanded that list of beneficiaries. Why are they just giving it with that sort of thought is something that makes us a bit concerned about what will audit comments lead to. Thanks.
Thanks, Himanshu. So we covered a lot of ground, actually, which was great in 45 minutes. So thank you all for joining. This is really helpful. And the nice thing is this is the beginning of a longer conversation as our sort of project keeps unfolding. So, we're all respectively almost pretty well in touch with each other. And we'll just make sure, Sanjeev in particular, that our discussions sort of intensify. But I think with that, otherwise all that's left is to thank you all for joining us. And for those who are watching this subsequently, I hope it's been an enjoyable session.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.